On the eve of his hanging, when the jail had gone quiet and even the guards spoke in whispers, Elias Crow sat alone on the narrow cot, listening to the wind move through the wooden beams of the gallows outside like a patient breath, a sound that seemed to know his name better than any man ever had, and in that long, stretched moment before the night fully claimed him, he understood that the legend written about him, inked in fear, sharpened by rumor, soaked in blood he never bothered to deny, had grown too loud to hear the truth beneath it, so he began to speak, not to the walls or the empty cell, but to the memory of the plains themselves, the same land that once held him like a promise before it learned to fear his shadow, and he confessed not to crimes, because those were already counted and waiting for him at dawn, but to a secret that had lived quietly inside him for years, a secret softer than the name, outlaw, and heavier than the rope that waited outside, a truth no sheriff had chased and no bounty hunter had ever guessed, because while the world believed Elias Crow was carved from violence and ambition, he had been shaped instead by longing and loss, by a single night many years ago when he chose mercy over glory, a choice that rewrote his life in ways no one ever noticed, and as the moonlight slid across the iron bars and settled on his hands the papers claimed were ruthless, he remembered how those same hands once trembled as he stood on the edge of a small homestead, watching a lantern glow inside a quiet house, knowing he could walk away with everything or step forward and lose the man he thought he wanted to be, and that night, when the wind sounded just like it did now, he had turned his horse aside and spared a life that would later become the reason he never slept through the dark again, because legends are born from what men do, but they are haunted by what they refuse to say, and Elias had refused to speak of the girl with the steady eyes, who saw through him without fear, who asked nothing of him except honesty, who taught him that gentleness could exist even in a world built on grit and gun smoke, and it was that memory, fragile, enduring, that followed him through every dusty town and every narrow escape, shaping the way he walked into danger without pride and left destruction behind without satisfaction. So as the hours thinned and the night leaned closer, Elias confessed how every step he took deeper into the outlaw's path was not driven by hunger for power but by a quiet belief that if he became dangerous enough, the world would stop asking him to choose between who he was and who he could have been, and yet here he sat, breathing slow, feeling the weight of every unsaid word, realizing that the Wild West would remember him as a warning or a monster, but never as a man who once loved the sound of the wind through open grass, who once believed that stillness could be stronger than fear, and as dawn waited just beyond the horizon, Elias Crow lowered his voice to a near whisper and admitted the final truth, that the blood-soaked legend was never the real story at all, that the most dangerous thing he ever carried was not a weapon or a reputation but a heart that refused to harden, a heart that chose silence over confession for too long, and now, with the gallows breathing outside and the night folding in on itself, he offered this secret to the land itself, hoping that somewhere beyond the rope and the names written about him, the truth might linger like the wind, unseen but unforgettable, ready to change everything anyone thought they knew about the Wild West. By the time the woman called Mara Vale rode into Red Mesa, the town had already decided what she was, because small desert towns survive on stories the way the land survives on scarce rain, and hers had arrived long before she did, whispered across saloon tables and passed quietly between men who touched their hats when her name was spoken. For they said she was followed by death the way shadows follow the sun, that every outlaw who had ever loved her had met a violent end, not because she wielded a weapon or spoke threats, but because fate itself seemed to take offense at her happiness, and so when she dismounted beneath the burning western sun, dressed in simple black with dust on her hem and calm in her eyes, the street went still in a way that felt unnatural, as if the town were holding its breath, watching to see whether she would bring ruin or merely remind them of it. And Mara noticed, of course she did. Because widows learn to read silence the way others read faces, yet she did not flinch or hurry her step, for she had long ago learned that fear grows when fed, and Red Mesa would not be the place she bent beneath it, not again, not after burying more names than she could count beneath lonely stones scattered across the frontier, each one once spoken with hope, each one now held only by memory. And she took the small adobe house at the edge of town where the land fell away into open desert, a place no one wanted because it faced the endless horizon and offered no neighbors, which suited her fine, because solitude had become both her shelter and her sentence, and for a time, the town left her alone, watching from a distance, confirming their beliefs as days passed without laughter or visitors, until one late afternoon, when the heat shimmered and the cicadas cried out like restless ghosts, fate arrived not on horseback but in collapse, as a wounded gunslinger stumbled from the desert and fell at her door, blood darkening his shirt, dust clinging to his skin, his breath shallow but stubborn, and Mara stood over him for a long moment, knowing exactly what the town would say if they saw him there, knowing the old fear stirring in her chest like a warning bell, yet she knelt anyway, because despite all she had lost, despite every grave that marked her past, she had never learned how to turn away from someone who needed her, and she dragged him inside with more strength than her slight frame suggested, cleaning his wound with practiced hands that trembled only once, just once, as she realized how familiar this felt, how many times she had done this before, how often hope had arrived bleeding and left her broken, and as the gunslinger drifted between sleep and waking, he murmured a name that was not hers, a life she did not know, and she wondered what kind of man fate had delivered this time, whether he would be gentle or reckless, whether he would stay long enough to matter, whether loving him, if love dared show its face again, would seal his end the way it had others. And when he finally woke, the sun low and the room washed in amber light, he looked at her not with fear or desire but with something quieter, something like recognition, as if he had been wandering for years and finally understood where he was, and he told her his name was Thomas Reed, that he had no intention of dying on her floor, and she smiled despite herself, a small, careful smile she had buried long ago. And in the days that followed, as his strength returned and the town watched from afar, their story began to unfold in the spaces between words, in the way Thomas helped with small repairs without asking, in the way Mara brewed coffee each morning and pretended it was habit rather than comfort, and the town noticed too, of course they did, men shaking their heads, women whispering prayers, because they had seen this before, or believed they had, and tragedy, they were certain, was already sharpening its teeth. Yet what no one saw was the way Thomas listened when Mara spoke of her past without pressing for details, the way he never mocked the rumors but did not fear them either, the way he treated her not as a curse or a prize but as a woman who had endured more than most, and in quiet moments beneath the burning sun, Mara felt something dangerous bloom again, something she had sworn never to touch, because love in the West was not soft or forgiving, it was a gamble played against distance, violence, and chance, and she had lost every time before. But fate is cruel not because it destroys hope, but because it revives it just enough to make loss sharper. And as Thomas healed and the town's unease deepened, men from his past began to circle like distant thunder, reminding Mara that no love ever entered her life without being followed by blood, and though she tried to warn him, tried to build distance with silence and restraint, Thomas only shook his head and said that running had never saved anyone he cared about. And so beneath the wide, unforgiving sky, with the desert watching as it always did, fate began weaving its familiar pattern once more, thread by thread, pulling two wounded souls together even as the shadows lengthened, promising beauty, promising sorrow, and daring them both to believe that this time, the ending might be different, even as the sun sank red over red Mesa, staining the horizon like an omen no one could quite escape. Deadwood Crossing lay stretched beneath a sky the color of old steel, a town worn thin by neglect and fear. And when Samuel Holt rode in at dawn, dust clinging to his coat and the slow creak of his saddle marking each step of his tired horse, no one reached for a welcome or a warning because the town had forgotten what law looked like, forgotten the shape of order and the sound of justice spoken aloud, and Samuel understood that kind of forgetting better than most, for he carried it with him like a second shadow, one formed years earlier when he had first pinned a badge to his chest and believed that wanting to protect people was enough to save them. Belief that died the night Deadwood Crossing lost its marshal and gained its ghosts, and as he dismounted near the empty hitching post, eyes followed him from behind curtains and broken windows, not because they recognized him but because they recognized the weight in his posture, the careful way he moved like a man who expected trouble but no longer hoped to outrun it, and the badge he wore, dulled and scratched and almost hidden beneath his coat, was not meant to be seen at all. Because Samuel Holt had not ridden here to claim authority or redemption, he had come only because the road had ended and the past had finally caught up, because some places call to the broken the way deep water calls to stone, and Deadwood Crossing had called him back whether he answered or not, and the town itself looked like a memory left too long in the sun, buildings leaning inward as if sharing secrets, the saloon quiet even at mid-morning, the air thick with the kind of tension that comes from living too long without rules, and Samuel remembered when this place had laughter, when children ran between storefronts and the sound of a bell marked the hours, before the gangs came and the lawmen left and fear learned to make itself at home, and he tied his horse slowly, feeling the ache in his shoulder where an old wound still lived, a reminder of the last time he had tried to stand his ground, the last time he had believed he could hold the line alone. And as he stepped into the street, a man finally spoke, asking if he was lost, and Samuel almost laughed at that, because being lost was the one thing he had been certain of for years, but instead he answered simply that he was passing through, a lie thin as paper, because Deadwood Crossing did not let men pass through anymore, not without cost, and the cost revealed itself before noon when a group of riders entered town, their horses hard-eyed and restless, their leader smiling like someone who had never been told no, and the townspeople shrank back instinctively, because they knew these men, knew the sound of their boots and the reach of their cruelty, and Samuel felt the old weight settle in his chest, the memory of a similar morning long ago when he had failed to stop a different group, failed to protect the people who had trusted him, a failure that had ended in fire and silence and the small, still shape of someone he loved lying where hope used to be, and he had taken off his badge that night believing it no longer deserved to be worn, believing that some men were not meant to be heroes, only witnesses to their own mistakes, and now, standing in the open street of a town that had already surrendered, Samuel faced the truth he had avoided for years, that running from the past did not make it weaker, it only taught it how to wait, and the leader of the riders noticed him then, noticed the way Samuel did not move aside, did not lower his eyes, and something curious flickered across the man's face, because even in a lawless place, men recognize resistance when they see it, and words were exchanged, sharp but measured, the kind that tests boundaries without crossing them, until the rider laughed and said Deadwood Crossing no longer needed a marshal, that it belonged to those strong enough to take it, and Samuel felt the badge press against his chest like a heartbeat he had forgotten, and he surprised himself by answering that towns do not belong to the strong, they belong to the living, and the silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the wind lifting dust between them, and for a moment, Samuel thought the riders might draw their guns and end it there, but instead they turned away with a promise to return, a promise spoken lightly but meant deeply, and the townspeople exhaled in fragments, some angry, some afraid, some looking at Samuel with a mixture of hope and resentment, because hope is dangerous in places like this, and later, as the sun dipped and the town gathered what courage it could, Samuel found himself sitting in the old marshal's office, a room that smelled of dust and old paper, where the desk still bore the marks of his hands from years before, and the weight of memory pressed in on him, every failure rising like a ghost asking to be answered, and the people came then, quietly, one by one, not asking him to save them but asking him to stay, to wear the badge again, to give Deadwood Crossing something it had not felt in years, and Samuel listened, his heart heavy, because he knew the cost of standing, knew that war was coming whether he chose it or not, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady not because he was fearless but because fear had taught him what mattered, and he said he would stay, not because he believed he could win, but because leaving had already cost him everything once, and as the night settled and lanterns were lit, Samuel Holt pinned the badge where it could be seen, not as a symbol of pride but as a promise to face the ghosts he had carried for too long, and Deadwood Crossing, broken and weary, seemed to lean toward him, waiting to see whether this last marshal would fall like the others or stand long enough to remind the West that even in the grittiest places, courage does not die quietly, it waits for someone willing to answer its call, no matter the price. Black Canyon was the kind of place the land itself seemed to avoid remembering, a deep scar cut through stone and shadow where the sun lingered only briefly and the wind spoke in low, unsettled tones, and it was there, in a forgotten mining camp marked by collapsed timbers and rusted tools, that Jonah Pike found the map, folded thin as skin and tucked inside a weathered Bible that had no business surviving so long, and Jonah, who had lost his claim, his savings, and nearly his will beneath the merciless weight of the desert, stared at the hand-drawn lines with a mix of hunger and dread, because everyone in the West had heard the stories of Black Canyon, had heard that gold ran through its veins like a dark promise, and that every man who tried to take it vanished or returned hollow-eyed and ruined, and they said the devil himself had laid claim to that canyon, cursing the gold so that it would whisper to men when they were weakest, offering salvation in exchange for something far more costly than blood, and Jonah told himself he did not believe in such things, told himself that stories were born from fear and failure, yet as he packed his mule and turned toward the canyon at dawn, he could not shake the feeling that the desert was watching him go, measuring his resolve. The way it measured all men eventually, and the farther he traveled, the quieter the world became, as if even the birds knew better than to follow, and by the second night, when the canyon walls rose around him like ancient judges, Jonah began to hear the whispers, faint at first, no more than the sound of wind slipping through stone, but shaped just enough to make his heart quicken, because the voice knew his name, spoke it with familiarity, reminding him of debts unpaid and chances lost, reminding him of the small house he once dreamed of building, the family he never had time to start, and the whispers promised that all of it could still be his, that the gold waiting beneath Black Canyon was not cursed but misunderstood like Jonah himself, and he told himself again that he was imagining it, that solitude plays tricks on desperate minds, yet each night the voices grew clearer, kinder even, guiding him through narrow passes and warning him away from sudden drops. And Jonah began to listen, not because he trusted them, but because he was tired of trusting nothing at all, and when he reached the marked place on the map, a narrow ledge overlooking a dark opening in the canyon wall, he felt a strange calm settle over him, as if the land had been expecting him all along, and inside the cave the air was cool and still, untouched by time, and there, glinting softly in the half-light, was gold, not scattered or hidden, but running clean and rich through the rock, more than Jonah had ever seen, more than any man could carry alone, and all washed over him, followed quickly by fear, because legends do not grow without reason, and as he reached out to touch the vein, the whispers returned, no longer gentle but insistent, telling him that the gold was his if he wanted it badly enough, that all it asked in return was devotion, not in words or prayer, but in choice, and Jonah's hand trembled as memories surfaced unbidden, memories of the men he had stepped over on his way west, the promises he had broken to survive, the moments when he had chosen himself over others without looking back, and the whispers pressed closer, urging him to take what fate had denied him, to stop pretending that goodness had ever paid a man's way in the Wild West, and for a long moment, Jonah stood at the edge of everything he had ever wanted, feeling the canyon breathe around him, and he understood then that the price was not death or damnation in the way stories like to tell it, but something quieter and more final, because the gold did not demand his life, it demanded his listening, his obedience, his willingness to let the whispers guide him always, shaping his choices until there was no space left for silence or doubt, until the voice in his head replaced his own, and the thought struck him with sudden clarity that the men who had vanished had not been taken by the canyon at all, but had simply stopped being themselves, had walked out into the desert carrying riches and left their names behind, and Jonah, weary and frightened, thought of the man he had been before the losses, before the hunger, when the world still felt wide and uncertain rather than narrow and cruel, and he pulled his hand back, stepping away from the gold as the whispers sharpened, turning cold, accusing him of weakness, of ingratitude, of wasting a gift meant only for those brave enough to accept it fully, and the canyon seemed to close in, shadows stretching like fingers, and Jonah felt fear rise sharp and real, but beneath it, something steadier took hold, the understanding that survival without self was another kind of death, and with shaking resolve, he folded the map, tucked it into his coat, and turned away from the gold, and the whispers rose into a furious chorus, echoing through the stone, promising that he would regret this choice, that the desert would grind him down until he crawled back begging. But Jonah did not answer, did not argue or plead, he simply walked, step by careful step, out of the cave and into the fading light, and when he emerged, the canyon was silent once more, as if nothing had happened at all, and the journey back was harder than the way in, the desert offering no guidance now, no warnings, no comfort, and yet Jonah felt lighter with each mile, as if something unseen had loosened its grip, and when he finally reached the edge of Black Canyon and looked back, the shadows lay still and ordinary, the whispers gone, and he understood that the devil's gold was not cursed because it killed men, but because it tempted them to give up the last thing worth keeping, and Jonah Pike returned to the open desert with empty hands and a future still uncertain, but with his voice his own and his name intact, and somewhere deep within Black Canyon, the gold waited patiently, gleaming in the dark, ready to whisper again when the next desperate soul came listening.